Hello and welcome everyone. Thanks again for joining us today for this webinar on Externalized Dynamic Authorization in a Microservices World. So we've got a few of the typical notes here before we get started. You are centrally muted and we'll be recording today's session as well so you can view and share it after the event. We'll make sure you all have a link to the recording by email for easy access. Now we hope you've come prepared with a few questions on this topic, and we'll be taking those questions at the end of the session. But in the meantime, you can submit your questions at any time in the GoToWebinar control panel. Now, for this session, Matt Carter and myself are your hosts. My name is Gerry Gebel. I'm the VP of Business Development at Axiomatics, and I'll be co-hosting this webinar with Matt, who spoke on the topic at the recent Cloud Identity Summit in Chicago. And we're going to do this slightly differently than we've done webinars in the past. So I've got a few questions lined up, and Matt has some slides prepared to answer those questions. So Matt, if you're ready to go, let's start off with the first question. So we're talking about microservices in this webinar today. But how is that different from the SOA world of the recent past?
Good day, Gerry, and all of our audience members. Well, there have been a number of technology changes since SOA went into the trough of disillusionment. I'm sure many of our listeners have played around with Docker containers and Amazon Lambda and serverless technologies, but more so than the technology, it's the principles of microservices that differentiate it from services-oriented architecture. Sam Newman was an author that wrote the book Building Microservices, and he talks about a number of principles that he's seen in his experience helping companies build MSAs, such as hiding implementation details, culture of automation, consumer-driven contracts testing, but the things that he sees as where organizations will get the most value out of leveraging microservices is having them be autonomous in the sense that they can deploy new versions of that business domain, and that business domain is very single purpose, and it's decoupled from other business domains so that they can deliver new functionality on a daily, even hourly basis without those dependencies. If you see on the next slide, we illustrate how Mr. Newman likes to represent microservices as hexagons because he says it defeats the tyranny of the layer. And what he means by that, in SOA, you had like the business layer, the business logic layer, the presentation layer, the data layer. In lieu of that, with microservices, each one has a name that describes what it does. Now, these microservices could be consumed by various composite applications or potentially asynchronously by other microservices. It also supports the notion of bounded context. So the accounts microservice can basically present data in a different context for support than, say, for CRM. Now, I poked a little bit of fun at Mr. Newman during the Cloud Identity Summit when he, in one of his YouTube videos, leads off with nested SAML assertions as an approach for securing microservices. And I've read his chapter on his book on securing microservices, and he basically talks about OAuth and OpenID Connect, some of these emerging technologies, but basically says that it's premature. Now, I know that book was published a couple years ago, so I'm sure his thinking has been updated since then. But what we're going to be talking about today are maybe some of the best practices in terms of authorization for these microservices and addressing some issues. Another notion of microservices is a term that gets thrown around as smart endpoint dumb pipe. And this is a departure from SOA in the sense that a lot of business functionality tended to seep into that service bus middleware layer, things like transformation and aggregation. And that became an issue from a microservices standpoint because oftentimes these services are deployed in infrastructure or cloud platform as a service providers or maybe an on-prem service provider. You don't necessarily know and you don't care where this is being deployed. So you can't have that single point of entry, that gateway service bus with all this business functionality, creating that tight coupling between the business service and the middleware layer. Scopes are a discretionary access control model that are used for the resource owner to delegate consent to the client to access. So this notion didn't necessarily exist in SOA. This was something that came with the OAuth technology that basically matured along with the microservices maturity spectrum.
Right. So yeah, scopes is an interesting aspect to think about here. You know, I know we're going to be talking more about that, but what are some of the needs and problems with regard to authorization in a microservice context that we have today?
Well, one of the things, Gerry, is that we are unfortunately not learning from our historic problems with web applications when that was a thing. If you look at the two statements we have here, the first one is a Spring annotation that basically is checking for the presence of a role to make a programmatic access control decision, and the second one is a J2E example doing the same thing, right? And back when developers were building web applications for single purpose, much like the way that we are doing it today with microservices, you know, they basically had that mindset that all it needs is authentication, or maybe we'll just pass it a couple of roles and we'll externalize the membership of those roles in LDAP groups. And what that created was a problem of role explosion, where these web applications became much more richer in function, and the amount of granularity in terms of access control increased significantly, and it became very hard to answer the question of who has access to what and who has done what, and that's something that I think we are repeating with scopes. Basically, the idea I think I hear from a lot of people is that my microservice is very simple, so I'm just going to do coarse grain authorization by passing it a couple of scopes, which essentially are just claims, and then my developers are going to check for the presence of that scopes. If you see, those two diagrams look exactly alike, and basically the pattern is very much alike. Unfortunately, the problems that exist are going to be the same as well. I think we're going to end up with not only a role explosion, but a scope explosion problem as well.
It all sounds quite familiar.
Absolutely. So, you know, you see the same annotations with OAuth, checking for the presence of a scope instead of a role, but the challenges are the same. And if you look at if you're familiar with the Dr. Seuss story, the Sneetches, you know, I think this is analogous to our consultants and vendors in the role-based access control space, basically being very happy to propagate these practices because they know they're going to be right back at the table saying, we can redesign your role model, or we can make it easier for you to certify all of the various entitlements and access control challenges that you have. And it's something that I think we need to break the cycle. If you click one more time, Gerry, you'll see that, you know, McBucky McBean's scope redesign machine will be the next release in our vendor cycle.
Roles 2.0.
Another challenge we have is a lot of times we have an issue with our web service clients violating the principle of least privilege in terms of either maliciously or accidentally being able to get more data than they're entitled to, because we basically don't control this confused deputy problem. We don't do checks to compare attributes of the resource, basically who the data belongs to, with the subject of who's calling it. That sort of claim-based or scope-based checking of do you have this scope doesn't address this issue typically. So I've seen in especially business-to-business type scenarios in the financial world where there just weren't any controls to ensure that the client wasn't getting more data or couldn't get more data than they were entitled to. A ramification of smart endpoint dumb pipe is that we're basically putting the onus on policy enforcement on each individual microservice developer. And while I'm a big fan of making sure that we have good security hygiene throughout the organization, I don't think we're there yet in terms of putting that pressure on developers to do the right thing. I think given the choice of best practices versus schedule and timeline and efficiency, they're going to choose, you know, the shortcut oftentimes. And if you look at the OWASP proposed 2017 list, that kind of backs up that assertion. You look at broken access control, this concern has been around since 0304. We're not getting any better at this. And now they've introduced underprotected APIs as a top 10 concern. You combine the two together, access control within APIs, I think that's going to be a huge challenge going forward. We're just basically opening up a new vector of attacking these applications.
Right, right. But it's good for, excuse me, it's good for OWASP to highlight this new vector for us. So then on to the next question, Matt. So what about authorization itself? Can or should that be treated as a microservice?
Well, let's look at some of the characteristics of a policy decision point. Now, I'm talking about an Axiomatics policy decision point in this context. That's what I'm familiar with. It's stateless and immutable, meaning that you don't necessarily have to do a lot to it once you spin up the PDP in a Docker container. It essentially gets an updated policy and it's ready to provide service. And it does that over a well-defined interface. It's standards-based via Example 3.0. And that's a lightweight REST JSON-based interface, so the protocol is very lightweight. And it supports the notion of bounded context through either namespaces or different policy trees or multi-project. You can separate out different business units and their specific local business policy separate and keep them separate from each other. And finally, it's fault tolerant in the sense that if the policy decision point needs an attribute from an external service and that back-end service isn't available, you'll still get a decision from the policy decision. It may fail closed, and you may not get a permit when you're expecting, you may not get that permit you were expecting. It may end up in a deny, but you will get a response. So I would assert that absolutely policy decision should be considered a microservice, along with all these next generation access control technologies like adaptive risk or OpenID Connect, user info profile, token validation. All of these services are just another call out from the other microservices or the composite applications. And I think this makes the conversation with your microservice architects and developers a lot easier. They get the idea of just make a call out to say, here's the subject, resource, action, and context. Give me a permit or a deny over that lightweight protocol. And this is something Axiomatics has been talking about for years.
Right, but I know most recently you've been thinking a lot about this topic, and we've had a number of internal discussions and also conversations with customers. So in the next section, can we talk about some of the best practices for thinking about authorization as a microservice? Absolutely.
Let's start with the idea of the separation of the resource server from the business service. A lot of times you'll see that microservice kind of munges those two things together. I think separating out the resource server and into like a lightweight API gateway or maybe like a ping access agent where you can have a high cohesion of policy enforcement both for token validation and for authorization separate from the business service. And that, I think, outweighs a lot of the risks of that coupling that I talked about early on, because you can essentially, one, you can mitigate that through automation, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a single point of entry. It can be a very lightweight coupled API gateway or agent along with that business service, but you're offloading that policy enforcement into a consistent approach. Now, if you look at, we can still maintain that dumb pipe, if you will, because we are externalizing the policy decision into that microservice. And this gives us the power of the comparison of the resource data and metadata characteristics. You notice that the business service in this diagram is labeled with personally identifiable information. If you look at trying to do this on the via scopes and claims-based approaches, where the OAuth authorization server is performing policy decision, oftentimes that's done on the token issuance leg, which happens before the actual business service call. So you lose a lot of the context around how that client is trying to access that data, and you often don't have any information about how that business data is labeled or characteristics about that. So the API gateway or the resource server is in a very strategic position to have all of the information about the client, about the resource owner, how it's being accessed, and being able to compare that with characteristics of the business data itself. And we can package that all together and make a very lightweight policy decision call. The policy decision service can in turn incorporate things like risk scores or GeoIP information from its own external sources if necessary. If it doesn't have all the information it needs to make its decision, it may need to supplement. But for the most part, you can make it a very lightweight, not a very chatty call, and very low latency policy decision. And we're going to talk about ways that we can not only block the transaction, but maybe block it plus do some additional stuff, or allow it, but allow some additional, do some additional stuff to the payload. I think that having that high cohesion of policy decisioning, basically having all of your domain-specific rules, each microservice being a business domain. Using this electronic health records example, we have, the primary care physician can only view data for their patient. That's a very specific policy to the electronic health records domain. Having that side by side with referencing more global-like policies, like how we handle PII may be consistent across multiple business domains. You can still have the domain policy authoring done through this tool in a centralized manner, but they can easily reference these cross-domain policies as well as more technology-driven policies like our confused deputy. That comparison of the resource owner subject from the identity with the metadata of the resource, some sort of characteristic of who owns that data or who the data belongs to, doing that comparison in a single place and having all these rules co-located has a lot of power, and it's very consistent to me with a microservices approach of high cohesion.
All right, excellent up until now. But our next question here is, well, why should we do externalized authorization for microservices?
Well, in my opinion, Gerry, data has a lot of value, and that organizations are going to want to share that data, either through mandates or for monetary reasons. And I think that APIs and microservices are a great way to share data externally with partners and consumers. But I think that not all of that data is going to be shared to all consumers. In other words, we're going to want to basically limit certain data in certain conditions. And what are some of the things driving that? One example is tiered subscription. How businesses build out their models for gold, silver, platinum, the rules in which who gets those levels may be driven off of contextual information like social media, have you referred a customer, what's your subscription level, how many free articles have you read. These sort of things drive what level you might be at, and then also mapping of those loyalty levels to the data or content that are trying to be accessed. So that comparison is a big driver for these dynamic externalized models. Another example is privacy and how we share data within the European community is obviously going to be different from the North American community. Now, in talking to some of our Intel customers, we know that Congress is mandating sharing in a lot of situations between our public utilities, our municipalities, and the Intel community, and that's bi-directional. And the utilities recognize that they have a lot of very sensitive data with how they price things, and so there's a lot of fighting about how this data is going to be shared, but the mandate is there. Within the data clinical trial in the biopharma industry, we know that people wear a lot of different hats and oftentimes work for different competitors, and there's a lot of sharing of this information across frenemies, if you will. So this is a big driver in terms of how data is shared, may be very contextual and very dependent on what hat you're wearing at that time, and auditing at a very granular level of what data is accessed and how it's used. So I mentioned the European example. This diagram tries to illustrate one thing, which is labeling the data with metadata, that basically having the owners of that data be the stewards of defining characteristics about that data, what region it might be from, whether it's PII, and if it is PII, what fields specifically make it PII. That's different from defining policy of who should get that data. We're essentially offloading the labeling of that data and allowing the policy decision engine separately to evaluate that, because the logic about who can access it is more likely to change. So this example shows that for a US-based client, the PII data, the Social Security number, needs to be redacted, versus the next slide where you have US data that can be allowed through and is not redacted. Very simple example, and we're actually going to show a demo after the slides of actual implementation of this using Apogee API Gateway. One of the best practices I like to talk about is performing that call out to the policy decision on the response leg of the round trip. The reason why you do this is that, one, that's where you have the information about the payload. You can introspect the data, and you can potentially affect it. So in the cases where you're going to permit the response going back to the client, but you want to filter certain fields, that's why you would do that on the enforcement leg, versus the request leg. You don't necessarily have all that data, and you can't really necessarily as easily affect the response going back. Now, going back to scopes real quick, a lot of times we see trying to perform dynamic management of scopes by having the OAuth authorization server call a policy decision point. That's fine. It's just incomplete, because, like I talked about, you don't necessarily have that context about the business call. So I think if you click again, I think it's important to have that policy enforcement at the microservice level. Also making that call out to the policy decision service at the time the data is being requested. I think that's absolutely necessary.
Okay, you talked about dealing with a single record. What if you've got multiple records to filter in this kind of microservice or API example?
Yes, so the singleton single record request maps very nicely to the XACML request response protocol. But I think when you're asking for multiple records, you have to change your thinking a little bit in terms of the patterns and how policy decisioning and enforcement needs to happen, because we're getting into the millions upon millions of record scenarios, and you're not going to want to necessarily make independent authorization calls on each of those. So what does that look like? go ahead and click through a couple times, Gerry. We're going to look at a couple of examples, very contrived, simple examples here. On the right, you have a data producer with various columns, shoe size, price, and color. And let's say we have different clients that need to access different sets of that data based on conditions. Client 1 only sees rows where the color is red. Client 2 needs to have the price masked out based on various conditions, such as what the shoe size is. So it's unrealistic to expect, in the next slide, creating separate microservices or data services for each of these clients, because we know the number of clients out there with IoT is expanding dramatically, and it's just not physically feasible to do that, create separate services for each of our clients. So ideally what we can do is use a logical control to filter the data based on the conditions in which it's being accessed. So if you look at the next slide, this is one technology that Axiomatics provides where we can essentially return as a service a modified SQL statement based on the conditions and the identity of the client that's accessing it. So this, if you think of this within a single microservice, the application layer or the data virtualization layer, for instance, basically gets that request for all records. That application can call the Axiomatics service to get that modified SQL statement, adding the predicate where color equals red for client 1, and it basically makes that modified query and gets back the subset of data appropriate for that client under those conditions. Now this is very easy to do with SQL because it's basically a standard. Yes, there are different dialects, but there's enough commonality that Axiomatics as a vendor can implement that. We don't necessarily have that luxury of doing it on JSON because requests and responses can look however people want. So what we need to rely on here are conventions within a community of interest or within your organization, or perhaps more vendor-specific solutions. Let's look at a couple of examples here. One approach might be having a JSON service that returns a JSON path. Now, because JSON path supports multiple records through wildcarding and predicates, we can basically return to an API gateway to say you need to mask a certain field or set of records based on certain conditions. That's one pattern that might emerge. Obviously, if you look at the next slide, the policy enforcement point, the API gateway, in other words, needs to understand what that mask and JSON path expression means and be able to actually perform the masking action. So there's work that you have to do on the policy enforcement side in order to accomplish something like that. A vendor-specific example is taking Google Apogee. They have a field filtering approach where you can essentially pass it an action, either include or exclude, an object and or a set of fields, and it already knows how to filter that data based on those values. So that could be something that could be returned through the JSON filter, or the way I've modeled it in our example today, just through an exactable obligation, and basically the data is filtered automatically through the native API gateway functionality. Just to give you an idea, and a little bit cleaner, I'm going to show you this in the Apogee user interface as well. Essentially, as we talked about, on the request, you're validating the token and just doing some basic checks, but all of the actual dynamic authorization happens on the response leg because we're introspecting the source data, making the call out to the policy decision service, getting the information about permit or deny. We can still block the transaction if we need to as a whole, but in this case, we're just going to permit it, but filter certain fields, and then leverage that native Apogee functionality to do so. So Gerry, if you could pass over presenter, I will go into our demonstration for this scenario.
Okay, and while you're doing that, Matt, I'll check out some of the questions that have been coming in and remind the audience again that you can submit questions into the GoToWebinar control panel. And Matt, you and I will be getting to those in a few moments, and then you can also show the rest of the slides if you're ready to do that when you're finished with the demo.
All right, sounds good. So what we have here is a mocked up microservice that is returning some basic record data about some employees. Records 124, 125, 126 with social security number, and we've labeled that as PII. We've labeled the region as EU, and then we have 3 more records in the US region that return 3 more records, and they're also PII, but we just have the region labeled accordingly. Now we have this exposed through the ABAC gateway. These are the direct requests that I've shown you here going directly to the microservice. If we look at it virtualized through the ABAC gateway, you can see that we have a PDP callout that essentially parameterizes these various metadata fields from the payload. We're basically checking to see that Boolean to see whether it's labeled PII, and if so, which fields are PII, and we're determining the region of the data. Within the pipeline here, you see I'm not actually using OAuth here. I'm cheating, so I'm sure sharp-eyed viewers would catch that, but the principle is the same. We're just validating a token on the request, and then we're introspecting some of the information, making the call out, and using ABAC functionality to filter fields. Within our policy, it's a very simple, straightforward policy where we're essentially looking at PII, and we're basically saying if that flag is set to true for the data being labeled PII, we've got a couple of very simple rules to say that for clients in the US, the physical client, not necessarily the characteristic of the identity, but the client itself, if it's in the US, we need to filter the PII fields, and we're basically saying, tell us which fields are PII, and that's what we will tell you to exclude within the obligation. And that's for EU data. For US data, we're just going to allow that through. So we don't have any conditions or obligations, we're just basically permitting it. So if we go back to our ABAC field, we're going to go into our trace and turn on some dynamic tracing here. And we're going to make our requests now through the API gateway, and we see that the social security number has been redacted from this response. You can see some of the diagnostic information that I've added here, that call out to the PDP within the gateway. We get back and exclude the social security number, and we're using native field filtering to redact that from the response. If we look at US data, that goes right through with the social security number. If we look at that within the, lost it, try it again. Make the request to the EU guys one more time. You can see the request coming in here, and I want to show you the PDP callout leg within the pipeline. Try to collapse this, and you can actually see the service callout request being populated dynamically with that data region of the data itself. We basically see the PII label, and then coming back from the policy decision service, you see the permit and then information on which fields should be redacted. And I'm sorry, that's not showing up in this. Oh, that's the US request, that's why. There we go. There we say. So it says here, permit but filter the social security number here. So this is an example of applying the single record to multiple records through the field filtering. Hopefully that illustrates kind of the examples we were talking about. So summing it all up here, we talked about separation of the resource server from the business data or business service for a high cohesion of policy enforcement, consistent template, consistent policy enforcement across all your different microservices. Treat policy decision as a microservice along with adaptive risk and your other next-gen access control systems. It just makes your conversation with your microservice developers a lot easier. It's just a service that you call to get a permit or deny based on subject action resource. We're going to make your job a lot easier. Utilize scopes for what they were intended for, delegated consent. Don't fall into the trap of saying, well, we're just going to use coarse grain access control and we're going to pass some scopes to these microservices because they're simple today and we're not too worried about, we're just going to let our developers deal with checking of what those scopes entitle you to do. I think it's a trap. I think we would end up running into a scope explosion problem very similar to what we saw with role-based access control for web applications. And finally, think about externalizing policy decision for those microservices as a capability. I think it enables you to realize newer business models like tiered subscription. It's going to make dealing with privacy concerns with GDPR and these things a lot easier. And if you want to read more about this, I think the Gardner report on dynamic externalized authorization is an excellent read if you guys are subscribed to that. And please check out some of the blog entries on externalized dynamic authorization and some other great content by our Axiomatics authors. There's some excellent information on this topic. So let's get to questions.
Yeah, Matt, we have a number of questions here, and thanks for showing the demo. It's always great to see this concept in action here. So you do have the one fan of the comment you made here that scopes are the new roles. So that was good to see. And the follow-up to that is, do you think part of the issue is that OAuth is more oriented toward the consumer space, and where this attendee was thinking that there's fewer official authorization rules associated there? Do you think that's a fair observation?
Well, my experience in terms of consumer-based OAuth, I was part of a project where we had a financial aggregator. Think of like intuitmint.com accessing data on various financial institutions. And some of the things I saw were some of the lack of controls around preventing confused equity. And I think a lot of these financials basically felt that these players like Intuit are going to be good citizens and they're going to do the right thing, and we're going to audit it, and they don't want to make the financial institution angry, right? That's fine to an extent, but I think a lot of times where you start getting into controls with delegation, the end user needs to understand what that scope means in order to make a decision on whether or not to delegate consent for Intuit to access that data from those financial records, right? So there's that understanding and to provide granularity for that. It starts getting confusion, and a lot of times what ends up happening, and there's evidence for this, that people are just going to push the button that says make my application work, and they're not making educated decisions on these things. So yes, there's absolutely a consumer aspect to this in terms of ease of use, and I think that's driving a lot of the auto scoping and auto approved scope type approaches, but really the institutions and the organizations have to implement these things in order to protect their own interests, to make sure that they're not sharing data in the wrong context or sensitive information incorrectly. It's for their own best interests.
Okay, very good. Now, Just one quick question here on token formats. You didn't mention this specifically in your presentation, but there's different kinds of tokens, and one question here is around JSON Web Tokens or JWT tokens. Are they usable in the context that you were describing?
Yes, absolutely. Tokens are a great way to both the JWT tokens as well as the OpenID ID tokens, right? That's a great source of context, right? Where the trap is to basically put a bunch of scopes in those tokens that people think can be used to drive access control. You can absolutely use that JWT token and have the policy enforcement point parse that and present context that the policy decision needs to make those decisions, or you could pass that JWT token as a whole to the PDP, and Axiomatics can certainly parse that and pull out the attributes that it needs. It needs to know where in the token to look and everything, so there's work that needs to be done there, but it's absolutely complementary and provides a great source of context for dynamic authorization.
Okay, very good. Now we've got an interesting question on autonomy here. So does keeping access controls, I'm sorry, let me start over. Does keeping access control rules of different microservices introduce another form of coupling? How do we assure the deployment of microservices remains autonomous?
That's a fair point. So in the slide where I present the electronic health record scenario, right, you have rules that are very specific to electronic health records there. And you could absolutely argue that that should be within the business domain and hidden from all other technologies, including policy decision. I think that having a multi-tenant approach where the authoring of those policies are still done by the microservice owners and the data owners, where they can create those rules, reference global rules where they don't necessarily have to know about how PII rules are managed and recreate those rules within their own domain. They're simply referencing them co-located with their domain-specific rules, and then just having the policy decision service, potentially you could have a microservice-specific policy decision service co-located with that business domain. So it essentially becomes part of that microservice from the policy decisioning service. So there are some nuances there, but I think you can absolutely support that notion of centralized policy decision service and local domain-specific services within the same architecture.
Okay, good deal. Let's switch gears then and follow up on the data filtering topic that you brought up. And the question here is it possible to execute a data filter as part of a database extraction or migration process? So they're saying they have customers who need to move copies of production data into test and development, and they're required to mask the PII based on unique customer-defined rules. And that's the the business or the compliance challenge, and also there's a question about performance. Do you want to address that one?
Sure. Let me start with the data masking for lower levels. Obviously a very common scenario where you want production representative data, but you don't want those sort of sensitive data details copied into the lower environments where you're doing your development and testing. So data masking technologies could absolutely subscribe to the dynamic SQL microservice that Axiomatics provides, getting that modified SQL statement when it's running that copy job, if you will, of taking the production data before it makes that query to the production data to get it. It's basically going to have that masked by the modified SQL statement, and then the new data set should be cleansed at that point. In terms of performance, I'm assuming the performance is more of a runtime concern of basically applications doing this on a regular basis, right? Not necessarily that asynchronous data masking scenario, but I have an application that has different consumers and we want different data for different times. Depending on how the policy enforcement is how it's implemented from a physical architecture standpoint. One possibility is putting a proxy between the application and the database. That's one manifest of that. And that obviously is going to introduce overhead. Oftentimes we find that that's offset by the reduced data that is passed through that SQL proxy. Other approaches involve like overloading the JDBC layer at the driver, and that takes out the proxy component, and which may improve the performance. But there's other trade-offs in that approach. So there's going to be a cost performance, often a cost to security that's often unavoidable when you're doing these sort of checks. It's just a matter of mitigating the performance concern, I think.
Right. But we've certainly seen our customers implementing, the database filtering and masking.
We've had success in certain scenarios, and I'm sure we'd be happy to talk about more specifics offline.
Hey there, we're having technical difficulties. We'll be on in just a minute.
This is Matt. I can take some of these questions. I'm not hearing Gerry's reading off of the questions, so let me see here. Can JSON payload be passed to the PDP, or must resource attributes be extracted before passing to the PDP, essentially? And the answer is either or. That's just a design decision on where you want the work to be performed on the policy enforcement side or the policy decision side. The Axiomatics PDP is certainly capable of pulling out both XML and JSON data through the appropriate expression language, whether it's XPath or JSON path. There's plenty of ways that the policy decision service can parse that out. All right, question about access review. Management is used to periodic access revalidation attestation using groups and entitlements. Can we do the same with authorization policy? Do you have tools for that? And I think that's an excellent question in terms of how do you certify who has access to what when now all of a sudden entitlements are dynamic in terms of context, right? It's not, in the olden days, or how a lot of certification access reviews are performed today. You're certifying that users have roles and what those roles can do. Now, with a dynamic attribute-based approach, it may be user can perform this action in certain conditions based on data that may be changing rapidly. Right, so that's a different conversation and something perhaps a lot of our auditors aren't used to. So do we have tools for that? Yes. So we have access review visualization tools and APIs, so that if you want to start integrating with some of your access review platforms, which I think is the best approach, because you want your role-based and your attribute-based certification side by side, in my opinion. So if you take some of your access review and access governance solutions and incorporate through APIs, essentially asking the question, what can Alice do in this application? What can Bob do in certain contexts? And we have the ability to essentially perform all the permutations and present various conditions in which that permission would be granted for certification purposes.
Hey Matt, it's Gerry. I'm back online. Sorry for the internet interruption there.
Glad you're back.
So do you want to, excuse me, do you want to take one more question here on the JSON payload? That one looks interesting.
We talked about that one already.
Excellent. I'll have to listen to the recording then for your answer.
All right, let's see. All right, here's one more question. How do you convince an application or an application developer that already has authorization to externalize it? And how does Axiomatics help with that? And it's a challenge that we deal with almost on a daily basis, dealing with legacy third-party COTS applications that aren't doing a great job of externalizing authorization. And some of the strategies we talk about, especially with microservices, a lot of these COTS apps are now being exposed through APIs to consumers that they weren't necessarily having before. So take advantage of this time of API economy exposure to implement access control at the API level. That's a very strategic time to introduce these sort of concepts. Another kind of legacy approach that Axiomatics is working on, and standard disclaimers about future product roadmap and everything, is we're looking at basically mapping kind of that externalized LDAP group checking to a dynamic authorization call. So where an application might say, is a user a member of this group, we essentially on the back end make that into a dynamic authorization call by emulating the LDAP interface, but on the back end there's no directory lookup. It's actually a calculated call based on various dynamic rules. So just to give you a flavor of how we're looking to address the legacy challenge with ABAC and group-based access control.
But you're right. That's a common question that we get for a number of scenarios. All right. Well, Matt, do you want to take this one last one? I keep saying that. What is the typical latency of a PDP invocation within the API gateway?
So if I understand the question correctly, what I'm really talking about what the latency of the policy decision service is, and what we tell clients oftentimes as a baseline. And granted, there's a lot of different conditions on what can happen and ways you can enhance the protocol level or caching strategies or whatnot. But essentially, where we start is about 2,000 authorizations per second in terms of policy decisioning, if they don't necessarily have to go out and pull attributes from an external source. So absolutely very performant in terms of not being a bottleneck for a high volume of API gateway calls. We never find that we're the bottleneck in those situations.
Right, right. We've definitely seen that. All right, well, Matt, I think we'll close the webinar at that point with that question. Thanks so much for putting together the material today, for sharing your thoughts on microservices. And we can also point our listeners to our events page on axiomatics.com for upcoming events. We've got a couple of conferences and seminars we'll be participating in. We'll get details on that up there in the near future, as well as future webinars. So we'll stay in touch that way. And thanks everyone for joining and listening in, and we hope to see you again very soon down the road. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.